There is a moment in every great story where the mask slips, where the glitter fades, the pyrotechnics die down, and what remains is something raw and uncomfortably real. For decades, Kiss gave the world everything it wanted: fire-breathing bass players, blood-spitting demons, and a guitarist who seemed to descend from the cosmos itself. And they sold out arenas before arena rock was even a term. They built an empire on spectacle, loyalty, and a sound so enormous it physically reshaped whatever room it filled. But strip away the face paint, the platform boots, and the pyrotechnic explosions, and what you find underneath is far more complicated than rock and roll fantasy. What you find is two men, brilliant, driven, and deeply flawed, locked in a relationship that was simultaneously the greatest creative partnership of their lives and one of the most painful experiences either of them ever endured. This is the story of Paul Stanley and Ace Frehley, not the version printed in the tour program, not the polished retrospective trotted out for Hall of Fame ceremonies, but the real story, and it is messier, sadder, and far more fascinating than anything they ever performed on stage. To understand how Paul Stanley and Ace Frehley ended up in each other's orbit, you have to go back to New York City in the early 1970s, which was not a glamorous time for the city by any measure. Crime ran rampant. The economy crumbled around ordinary people, and the music scene existed as a chaotic mix of ambition, desperation, and raw talent pressing up against each other in small rooms. Stanley Eisen, a kid from Queens who carried a hearing impairment in his right ear along with a burning desire to become something, started building what would eventually become one of the most recognizable brands in music history. Paul Stanley operated with meticulous intention from the beginning, and his vision for Kiss carried an absolute quality that left no room for half measures. The band was not going to stumble into success, and Stanley never entertained that possibility for a single moment. Kiss would be engineered, constructed, and executed with a precision that most rock bands never even attempted. He wanted spectacle, loyalty, and professionalism in equal measure. And into this carefully constructed machine walked Ace Frehley, a guitarist from the Bronx who arrived at his audition in 1973 wearing mismatched clothes and radiating an energy that sat somewhere between eccentric and completely unhinged. He got the job anyway, and the reason was simple. The moment Ace plugged in and started playing, everyone in the room grasped immediately that this man carried something no amount of training could produce. His guitar work ran on instinct, ferocity, and a completely unique sensibility that separated him from every other player working in rock at the time. Shock Me, Cold Gin, and Parasite all carried his fingerprints in ways that made those songs impossible to imagine without him, and the fans understood this on some level even if they never articulated it consciously. The spaceman persona fit him so naturally because he genuinely seemed to operate on a different frequency from ordinary people, mysterious and untethered, somehow simultaneously of this world and alien to it. Audiences connected to Ace Frehley in a way that even Stanley, for all his charisma and showmanship, sometimes struggled to replicate, because there was something about Ace that felt genuinely unfiltered and genuinely dangerous, and crowds could feel that quality the moment he stepped onto a stage. But what thrills an audience can absolutely terrify a bandmate. And for Paul Stanley, working alongside Ace Frehley became an exercise in controlled anxiety from very early on. Stanley arrived early, prepared thoroughly, and held everyone around him to the same standard. His work ethic forged in hunger and ambition and applied without compromise or apology. Ace Frehley operated on an entirely different frequency, one where rehearsals were optional, schedules were suggestions, and the things Stanley treated as sacred, punctuality, preparation, consistency, carried no particular weight. It was not laziness in any simple sense, but rather that Ace seemed to exist in a parallel reality where conventional professional rules simply did not apply. And while that quality was part of what made him so compelling as an artist, it made him extraordinarily difficult to count on as a colleague. The friction between them built slowly at first, accumulating through years of small irritations until the collective weight became impossible to ignore or work around. By 1979, when Kiss recorded Dynasty, those accumulated tensions had grown into something that could no longer be professionally smoothed over. Ace's struggles with alcohol and drugs were no longer background noise. They had become the main event, progressing to a point where his substance abuse directly affected the music, threatened the band's reputation, and created wreckage that other people had to clean up. Paul Stanley found himself in the role of caretaker more often than he found himself in the role of creative partner, picking up pieces Ace left behind in studios, in interviews, and on tour. The emotional weight of that position, frustrated colleague, disappointed friend, reluctant caretaker, accumulated quietly and left marks that never fully healed. What makes Stanley's account of this period so worth examining is the complexity underneath his anger, because he was not simply furious at Ace, he was furious and heartbroken at the same time. And the heartbreak came from knowing exactly what Ace was capable of and watching that capability get consistently undermined by self-destruction. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives when you watch someone brilliant waste themselves, and Stanley experienced that grief inside a very public, very high-stakes environment where millions of dollars, millions of fans, and a reputation built through years of relentless work all sat exposed to whatever chaos Ace brought with him on any given day. The casualness of it may have been the hardest part to forgive, not the failures themselves, but the apparent indifference to what those failures cost everyone around him. Stanley kept the machine running through sheer determination, while Ace's behavior repeatedly threatened to dismantle it. And that dynamic produced a specific kind of resentment that tends to outlast whatever affection originally existed between people. None of this erased Stanley's awareness of what Ace contributed, but it layered over that awareness with something heavy and permanent, a coating of disappointment that no reunion, no tour, and no retrospective conversation ever fully stripped away. Gene Simmons entered this dynamic as the third major force, and his conflict with Frehley cut even deeper in some ways because it operated at a philosophical level rather than a practical one. Kiss co-founder, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, and the man behind the demon persona, Simmons had built himself into a commercial force through strategic thinking that bordered on relentless, and he saw Kiss as a business long before most musicians were willing to use that word without apologizing for it. Licensing deals, merchandise, the Kiss Army fan club, commercial partnerships across dozens of product categories. Simmons viewed all of it not as a compromise of artistic integrity, but as an extension of the Kiss vision, and history proved him right in purely financial terms. But for Ace Frehley, who grew up on rock and roll as a raw and rebellious force, the transformation of the band into a commercial empire felt like a slow suffocation of everything that had made Kiss worth caring about in the first place. The disagreements between Simmons and Frehley went beyond creative differences and landed somewhere closer to a fundamental incompatibility of values, with Simmons accusing Ace of lacking dedication, while Ace dismissed Simmons as domineering and money-obsessed. Simmons wanted structure, precision, and execution, while Ace craved spontaneity and organic energy. And in the studio, this difference produced arguments over production choices that repeatedly boiled over into something uglier. Ace felt stifled by Simmons's push for polished, controlled sounds, and Simmons grew increasingly impatient with what he saw as Ace's refusal to serve the band's collective interests. Neither man was entirely wrong in his reading of the situation, which is part of what made the conflict so unresolvable. They were simply built differently, wired for different priorities, and no amount of shared history or commercial success was ever going to bridge that gap. Within the original Kiss lineup, the relationship between Ace Frehley and Peter Criss added another layer of volatility to an already unstable situation. On paper, the two should have been natural allies, both outerborough New York guys from working-class backgrounds, both slightly overshadowed by the dominant personalities of Stanley and Simmons, and both occupying a somewhat peripheral position in the band's internal power structure. Early on, genuine camaraderie existed between them, a sense of brotherhood that came from their shared position as the junior partners in the enterprise. But shared struggle does not automatically produce loyalty, and in the case of these two men, it more often produced competition, resentment, and explosive confrontation. Both carried volcanic tempers. Both were fighting serious substance abuse battles that progressively worsened, and when two people built that way spend enough time together under intense professional pressure, the results tend toward the destructive rather than the supportive. Outside Kiss entirely, Ace's reputation for being difficult followed him like a shadow into every professional context he entered. Producers who worked with him during his solo years came away with stories ranging from mildly amusing to genuinely alarming, and fellow musicians who admired his guitar playing from a distance frequently discovered that collaborating with him in practice delivered a completely different experience. The enthusiasm and raw energy that made him magnetic in a live performance setting could evaporate without warning the moment schedules and expectations appeared. Frehley proved notoriously unreliable about showing up on time, about showing up at all, and about arriving in a workable condition when he did appear, and those qualities made long-term professional partnerships functionally impossible. A trail of fractured working relationships accumulated behind him across years, each one a reminder of the painful gap between his gifts and his ability to manage them in any sustainable way. His relationship with the press added yet another complication to an already complicated public profile. Gene Simmons was practically engineered for media interaction, charming, provocative, always controlling whatever narrative surrounded him with calculated precision. Paul Stanley had developed over the years into a thoughtful and polished interview subject who understood how to represent the band's interests even when answering difficult questions. Ace Frehley approached journalists the way he approached most things he found irritating, with open defiance and a flat refusal to play along, bristling at questions he found intrusive and responding to critical probing with curt or abrasive remarks that gave reporters exactly the material they needed to paint him as unstable. The spaceman persona, which should have given Frehley a mystique that worked in everyone's favor, got repeatedly undermined by his own combative behavior in exactly the situations where cooperation would have served him best. He rejected the idea of being managed or handled, but in doing that, he handed the narrative about himself to people who were not careful with it. Ace Frehley left Kiss for the first time in 1982, and the departure carried the weight of something both predictable and genuinely devastating. Predictable because the trajectory had been visible for years, the warning signs flashing so consistently and so brightly that ignoring them had become its own kind of institutional decision. Devastating because whatever his limitations, Frehley was irreplaceable in a way that nobody inside the band could fully acknowledge at the time without also acknowledging that they had failed to protect something worth protecting. The spaceman costume could be placed on another body, and eventually it was, but the specific quality of Ace's playing, that reckless, instinctive guitar work that sounded like it came from somewhere beyond rehearsal and preparation, could not be manufactured by a substitute no matter how technically proficient. Kiss continued, found another guitarist, and kept moving forward, but something was missing in a way that fans felt and Paul Stanley felt even as he simultaneously experienced something like relief at no longer managing the chaos Ace carried with him everywhere. The solo career that followed played out in a way that felt frustratingly familiar to anyone who had watched Ace inside Kiss. His 1978 solo album remains one of the best-selling in the extended Kiss universe, and New York Groove stands today as one of the most purely enjoyable rock singles of its era, a song with a joy and energy that captures everything Frehley could do when circumstances aligned in his favor. But sustained success stayed out of reach, and the same personal problems that had plagued him inside the band followed him into everything he attempted outside of it. The talent was never in question, never even remotely in doubt, but the question was always whether that talent could be organized into something lasting, whether Ace Frehley could find a way to be both the wild spirit his music required and the functional adult his life demanded, and for long and painful stretches of his post-Kiss years, the answer was visibly no. The reunion tours offered genuine moments of hope alongside confirmations of patterns that had never actually changed. When the original four members came back together in the mid-1990s for what became one of the most commercially successful reunion tours in rock history, the chemistry between them was undeniable on a level that went beyond nostalgia into something more like restoration. Seeing those four faces together, in that makeup on stages that stretched as far as the eye could see, created an emotional experience for audiences that justified every skeptical thought people had going in. But the old behaviors were stubborn, the old tensions reignited with a speed that suggested they had never fully cooled, and by the time the reunion had run its course, it had also exhausted whatever goodwill powered it. Ace departed again, And the second departure hit harder because the hope had been higher and the disappointment arrived, carrying the full weight of something that had already happened once before and should not have been allowed to happen again. Paul Stanley's reflections on all of this carry a hard-won quality that only comes from living through something genuinely difficult over a long period of time. He does not reduce Frehley to his worst moments or let accumulated frustration erase the memory of the talent and the human being behind it. But he also does not pretend that Ace was simply a victim of circumstance or that the damage belonged to someone else. What Stanley puts into words when he speaks about Frehley with honesty is the experience of admiring someone's gift while being hurt by their self-destruction, of maintaining respect for what someone built while sitting with the wreckage of what they destroyed along the way. That is not a simple emotional position to occupy, and the fact that Stanley can articulate it without completely hardening into resentment or dissolving into sentimentality says something about how much the experience cost him and how long he has spent processing what it meant. Ace Frehley gave Kiss something that resists quantification. The solos, the songwriting contributions, the spaceman persona, the way he moved on a stage and made every person in a 50,000-seat arena feel like they were watching something slightly dangerous and completely authentic. He stands as one of the most beloved figures in rock guitar history, and his playing shaped a generation of musicians who grew up wanting to produce that exact sound. That legacy endures and will continue to endure regardless of everything else. But the honest accounting of Ace Frehley's story requires holding both things at once: the genius and the wreckage, the gift and its price, the music that will outlast everyone involved and the relationships that did not survive the making of it. Paul Stanley built the Kiss machine and kept it running through force of will, carrying permanent scars from the effort. Ace Frehley lit the machine on fire every time he plugged in, giving it an electric and unpredictable quality that no amount of professional planning could ever manufacture, and he has carried his own weight from those years ever since. Together, they created something that mattered deeply to millions of people across decades, and the conflict, the grief, and the wasted potential do not diminish that. They are simply the other side of the same coin: the cost of the music, the price of the legend, and the story that will outlast both of them.